Let's back up a slide. Can everyone see that first slide?
Looks good, Kelly. Thank you.
Okay, good deal. So I just want to talk about the CCS has always been kind of a different approach, and also provides some new opportunities, specifically to private landowners. But I envision that over the long term of the program, as long as mitigation is done, I think there will be other opportunities that will exist on public lands as well. So I want to hit on a few of those. This slide is just a very basic kind of breakdown of how the credit system works. We look at the acres, we look at the habitat quality within those acres, and that generates our functional acreage. And then we have other factors that we put into the equation, like, you know, the meadow, the quality of the meadow, and what management category, meaning priority, general, or other. That's how the priority habitats are categorized into those three categories. And then after those factors are computed, we have the credits, and the credits become available for transfer or sale. And after the transaction is made, of course, there's a contract, a management plan is in place for the credit producer that they must follow, and a reserve account, which is essentially a portion of the sale, the money, or I'm sorry, the credits, a portion of the credits from the sale are set aside in a reserve account that functions essentially as as kind of an insurance policy against the risk of loss to any of the existing credit projects due to fire or other natural causes for loss. And then financial assurances are set up by the credit producer. That essentially is money that is set aside for the long-term monitoring and maintenance of the credit site. And then we, of course, over the course of 30 years, the minimum requirement for credit production is 30 years. And so over that 30-year period, there are incremental tracking and reporting that is required. So just to give you an overall look at kind of the status of mitigation in Nevada. And so hopefully people can see the green dots are the credits that are either anticipated, meaning they're very close to being finalized and available, and then available credits. So those are the ones that have management plans in place and have credits available for sale or transfer. And the purple, I think there's only one. It's in the Sonoma Mountain Range there, the southeast side of Humboldt County. That's where the entirety of the credits generated at the site have been transferred to offset a debit project. And in the red are existing debit projects that have already been conducted mitigation. And the yellow or yellowish orange dots are those debits that are unmitigated, and that's likely because they're in some state of finalizing NEPA or aren't quite ready to begin their project. So you can see a pretty busy map. Most of the activities that we monitor fall within the red polygons, which compose the WAFWA management areas. Those are essentially the sagebrush, the large kind of regional sagebrush areas in Nevada. And this slide comes from, so a lot of these slides I just kind of borrowed or took from semi-annual or annual reports that we submit to the governor. And so this has the latest information On the upper left, you'll see the cumulative credit projects from 2016 to 2021. And you can see a pretty steady increase in total credit projects over that 5-year period. We started out in 2016 with some state funds that allowed us to reach out to private landowners to help us get the bank seeded with credits. And so the state funded those credit projects to kind of get them on the books and get them up and going. And then again in 2017, we had another round of grants that we issued to private landowners for the production of more credits. And then you can see that number has steadily increased over time. As those credit projects that have been state funded sell their credits, they're required to reimburse the state the dollars that were needed initially. There's no interest associated with it. We let them use the funds to get their credits established and in the system. Then they reimburse the state, and then when we have a large enough pool, we make those funds available for another round of funding for private landowners. You can see the big increases occurred in the years that we did have funding and we were able to fund, and the other years show some incremental increases, and those were credit producers that produce their credits on their own dime. And so we believe that as people become more familiar with the credit system and the need for mitigation, that eventually there may not be a need for the state to continue to fund private landowners. We think the private sector will probably take a bigger stake in reaching out to landowners that have the potential to grow credits and make credits available, and there'll be probably direct communication between those needing to buy credits and those with the potential to generate credits. On the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side, you can see the cumulative debit project. So a debit project is something like mining, or someone that puts in a transmission line, or a geothermal or a solar power type of industrial project. And you can see there was definitely a steady incline from 2016. You can see a significant jump in 2019. And I believe that there's the main reason for that was in 2019, up until 2019, mitigation was, it was partly voluntary, and there were also other opportunities for people to do their mitigation other than using the CCS. The CCS was a little unknown at the time, and there was no mechanism to require people to use it. That changed in 2019 when the state adopted a regulation enforcing mitigation of all anthropogenic disturbances, or most anthropogenic disturbances on public lands. And so from 2019 till currently, you can see a significant increase. And in fact, 2021, we saw our largest increase in projects, where we jumped from under 25 to over 50. So the number of transactions, you can also see pretty slow start. In 2019, the regulation took effect. There was a pretty good bump. Another significant bump in 2020, and then a very significant jump in 2021. And then the cumulative debits offset, you can also see that corresponding fairly tightly with the regulation. In 2018, we had our first transaction. That was one transaction that made up about 2,500 credits that were transferred, and then a little increase from 2018 to 2019, but we anticipate seeing just from the number of credits, debit projects here. You can see almost a twofold increase. And so we expect this bar graph next year to probably correspond to that increase. So here's just another slide, an overview of the credits available within the system. You can see the number just under 5,000 credits have been transferred. You can see a fairly significant chunk of credits that are available, about 30,000 credits that are available. And then we have some anticipated credits, and those are credit project proponents that aren't quite at the point of signing their management plan and having those credits available. But in total, there's just, we anticipate about 34,000 credits being available in this system. And then to jump into debit projects, and so you can see a list of a number of those. You can see the anticipated debits associated with them in that left-hand column next to the name of the project. So generally, the smaller the number, it doesn't always correspond this way, but generally, if it's a small number of debits being generated, it's probably some type of exploration or maybe some minor modifications or increases to existing features. But nonetheless, we anticipate about 22,000 debits being needed. So we have about a 10,000 credit surplus in the system currently, which sounds very positive, but not all of the debit projects are listed on this slide. And the reason for that being, we don't list projects when we first become aware of them or early in the NEPA process, because at that point there are a lot of things that can happen, and of course NEPA is kind of an ongoing process that can take several years in some cases to get through. But we have been working on projects for several years, and now we believe that the number of debits that will be needed, in addition to what you see there, about 22,000 debits, we think there will be an additional 40,000 debits over the next couple years, possibly coming in and requiring mitigation. So at some point it's a little alarming because we may run a deficit in the number of credits needed to offset these projects. And I'll touch on that, kind of what we've known this we've known that to be a possibility, and so we've made some efforts to hopefully relieve some of that pressure that might be on the system in case we do run out of private land credits being available. But for private landowners, this is a significant opportunity for them, because it essentially benefits them financially for both previous and ongoing stewardship, which is a fairly new concept in Nevada. And I think that it's really beneficial. As I mentioned earlier, a certain amount of the funding has to be set aside to assure that monitoring and maintenance of the project will be conducted throughout the term of the project. And we hope that some of the funding that's generated through the credit sales may go back into conservation on the land, but it's not required. We don't require that, so that's up to the landowner. And within the system, just as an example, early on, all credit producers were required to remove pinyon and juniper trees on the credit project. And now, instead of just making that a requirement, we offer significant financial incentives to conduct that work. And also, we've been proactive in the fight against cheatgrass. Cheatgrass within our system, once it reaches 30% cover, negates any credits available on the site. And so it makes it an unproductive site in many ways, but especially in the ability to generate credits. And so in those areas that are identified, the landowner has significant financial incentive to maybe not completely reverse the annual invasive cycle, but to at least reduce it and be compensated for those conservation practices. And then additional credits can be generated through the implementation of successful conservation practices. So if someone does an enhancement, we go out, we measure their credits. Just for an example, they generate 100 credits, and then they implement some conservation practices, and they generate an additional 25 credits from those conservation actions. Those additional credits can be used for purchase or for sale at a future date. So, so there is incentives to do good conservation work on these projects if it's available. And our program can likely be used in tandem with an authorized candidate conservation agreement with assurances. And that generally, I believe, is authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've been working with them and NDOW, getting something set up that would provide an additional level of assurance, say, were sage grouse to become a listed species. So that's one example. I think our program can work with a number of other programs in tandem. So there might be easements and other funding opportunities that the landowner can still utilize and still be eligible for the program in most cases. So, and then finally, the opportunities on public land. So years ago, we saw the potential for a greater need for credits than what might be available on private lands. And so we proposed credit development on public lands. And that was a very difficult process in getting to that point, but we were able to get there. Right now, it's the only way that credits can be generated on public land. There has to be measurable uplift. And so we went for the low-hanging fruit, which was PJ removal. It's pretty easy to ascertain the number of trees before removal, and then what remained after removal, and then also meadow enhancement type projects. So currently in our system, those are the two main methods for generating credits on public lands. And I will mention that the reason it was challenging to get credits on public lands is if anyone were allowed to generate those credits, it would become essentially a commodity. And therefore would have to go through a process and maybe even a bid process, and they're just not set up to handle yet credit production as a commodity. Not to say that they couldn't in the future, but at the time we were getting this developed, it was very challenging, because if they're going to make credit generation available, they have to make it available to anyone. And so that presented an issue. And so in these cases, the entities responsible for the credit generation on public lands are the same entities that are being required to mitigate. So it's going to be the geothermal or mining companies that that are looking to generate credits on public lands. But having said that, I also believe that there is strong potential for partnerships to be developed with those entities that are needing to generate credits on public lands. And so I think there's opportunities both for livestock permittees and others to kind of join hands and either do the treatment or do the monitoring on the behalf of the credit producer, or implement ongoing conservation activities. So I do believe that there will be opportunity available to a host of people on this public land credit potential. And then obviously in Nevada, there's a limited supply of private land credits. Number one, there's a limited amount of private land in Nevada. And then of that land, there's a limited amount that falls within one of the three habitat categories. And then beyond that, there are probably some folks that, regardless of where they're situated, and they may not have an interest in generating credits or participating in a government program. So there are limitations with credit generation on private land, so we have to look to doing more on public lands. And to be quite frank, most of the disturbances, in fact, all of the disturbances that we're offsetting are occurring on public land. So it makes sense to have a certain amount of conservation occurring on those public lands. And we are exploring other opportunities for credit development on public lands, mostly centered around recovery after fire, because that's where the need is probably the greatest in the state of Nevada. But I think that to think that mitigation is going to get us out of the decline that we currently find ourselves in is misleading. But I do think that we could probably play a little more significant role in the recovery after fire. And so we're currently looking at opportunities to do that. And with that, I'll entertain any questions. I have the current members of the Sagebrush Ecosystem technical team on the screen, and their email addresses, and then our web page for the program, and the phone number to reach us.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Yeah, we definitely have some time for questions. I see some hands up. Lewis, go ahead.
Thanks for presenting, Kelly. Appreciate it. Just a quick question on generating credits on public land. So like the example you gave of removing PJ on public land, that's something that requires NEPA analysis. But as far as entering the ground, public ground into the credit system, is that something that needs to be separately analyzed by NEPA? Or how does that work?
Yeah, it would, if NEPA hasn't already been analyzed, and there are some areas in Nevada, especially for pinyon juniper, where there are NEPA-ready projects. So they've already analyzed it, they just don't have the funding to conduct the activities. And so there is potential that exists right now to go out and probably be able to do that in pretty short order. There are also opportunities that if it's done for the sake of conservation, it can go as a categorical exclusion. I think up to 10,000 acres, they can do a CX. And so there's that opportunity. On meadow or riparian enhancements, that there may be some specific projects that are NEPA ready, but more than likely in those cases, and this is where we're trying to get the message out to, you know, the big to some of the industries that if they're looking at conducting some conservation activities on public lands, we need to be, and they need to be informed as to where it could occur and probably conduct NEPA analysis on the credit side of things at the same time they're going through a NEPA analysis on their debit project or on their, whether it's mining or geothermal. So it does add a layer of complexity, and that's why we'd like to get this out in front of folks. It's why we are required to be notified of any pending actions even before, and be a cooperating agency so that we can have open correspondence with these credit buyers early on to be able to discuss the options that they might have for satisfying their obligation.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to be really surprised if I don't have a question from somebody asking how much is a credit worth.
What's your
Kelly,
answer?
this is Ethan from State Parks. I'm wondering how much are these credits typically worth?
You could probably answer that question, Ethan. In the past, we've had a wide range that probably has not been very helpful to anyone. So most of the transactions that take place are done privately. We know the number of credits or debits being exchanged or offset, but we don't always know the amount of the transaction. That's something it's a private negotiation between the credit buyer and the credit seller. But we have had some that have been willing to share that amount with us. And so I'm comfortable to say that we've seen credits sell for $1,200 per credit, up to about $2,300 per credit. But I've also heard folks say that they wouldn't sell their existing credits for less than $3,500. Whether or not they'll be able to market them is another question, but they certainly have that right to ask the higher amount. And I think that we see this wide range for a number of reasons. Number one, the program's new. Number two, if you have 1,000 credits and someone wants to buy 4, you're still obligated to do all of the paperwork and everything that's required within the transaction. So it makes that small transaction rather expensive to conduct. And so in the cases of transferring a small number of credits, they may ask a higher amount. Whereas if they're willing to buy, say if a person has 1,000 credits available and the entity wants to buy all 1,000, they might be able to offer a little price break, knowing that they're going to have a single transaction. So and of course, the level of management and monitoring and any scheduled conservation activities also goes into pricing these. So we do have a spreadsheet that we share with folks that are generating credits to give them some idea of what just the cost of the generation of these credits is costing them. And that may include reimbursing the state if they've used state funding to enter their credits into the system. So there are a number of factors that go into pricing these credits. But I think that over time they'll probably will reach some level of I wouldn't say like a more narrow price point that all of them will sell at, because I think there will always be differences depending on availability and so on, and location. And I have heard some folks voice some concern over making public lands available for credit generation. Just thinking that it might be a less expensive alternative to do that. But there are significant restrictions for credit generation on public lands, and there are additional costs with generating credits on public land, like conducting NEPA or paying for cost recovery in a case where NEPA was already done and paid for by the agency. We also require, I think it's 25 or 30% of the credits that are generated on public land go into the reserve account, which is 2 to 3 times higher than what private land credit producers have to contribute to the reserve account. So it's by no means a free lunch or a free ride to generate credits on public land. And most of that, was when we considered private or public land credit production, we had to take into account such things as risk, the risk to wildfire especially, and also the risk to future development. And so there was a significant amount of planning that on our part to ensure that the majority of these credits, if they're generated on public land, will stand hopefully for a very long term.